This week's episode is about the art of writing a literary essay, something a little different than a research paper. For students accustomed to essays that require a lot of research, citations, and arguments on a specific topic, writing English for English 101 or grade 12 English can be a real puzzle. This type of essay necessitates a more in-depth analysis of a particular text, or oftentimes only an excerpt of a text. At first glance, this may seem easy, but it's actually quite difficult and requires a high level of analytical and strong writing skills. We thought this topic would be helpful to our listeners who are attempting their first literary analysis in university or are in grade 11 or 12 and trying to complete their English class essays. Remember that writing is a practice and it takes time and effort to improve. So this week's guest is Natalia Hunter. She is a new coach at PFAU Academic Writing, and she has a master's in English from Wilfrid Laurier University and also a Bachelors of English and Medieval Studies. While pursuing graduate school, she was also a teaching assistant for the Laurier English department, led several weekly tutorials, and worked closely with many students to assist them in writing their papers and understanding the course material. She cares a lot about good writing and critical thinking skills, and her own experience as a TA and also a graduate student have made her into a great coach here at PFAU. So we look forward to talking to her today and her giving us some advice to you students out there who are maybe taking a mandatory English class, or you're thinking of becoming an English major, or like I said, you're in grade 12 and those English grades really matter a lot to get into university. So welcome to our podcast, Breathe In, Write Out, Natalia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Why did you decide to pursue an English degree? And also, why did you come to Canada? Because you're originally not from Canada.
I'm originally from the UK. So I came over here in 2014. I actually came over here because my mum did her Master's of Education at Western. And so that's why we came to Ontario specifically. And then I decided to do my BA at Laurier. And I decided to focus on English literature because I really enjoyed reading when I was younger, and it's still a massive hobby of mine. And I just wanted to kind of dig deeper into something on an academic level and personally as well. Didn't really know what I wanted to do kind of career-wise at the time, but it was just kind of I knew that I wanted to continue in academia, and I wanted to focus on something that I was passionate about. So that's why I chose to do English. Yeah.
Cool. Do you remember, you said you like to read a lot. Well, do you remember the first book you read or the first book that made an impression?
I don't remember the first book, but I was a big Harry Potter kid. That was my generation. I remember going to like the midnight releases of the new books, and that was a big part of my childhood. So that definitely was something that shaped my love for reading.
How did you think about the movies? I never read the books. I only watched the movies. People complain that, I read the book, the movie is not the same.
Yeah, I would say absolutely hands down, read the books. They're always going to be the best in my eyes because there's just so much detail that they can't put on the screen. But I do like the movies. I think that they did a great adaptation, and there's just something magical about them too, in a different way to the books. So I'm happy with the movies, but I'm always going to recommend the books. Yeah.
And what about that series, other than it being popular, really kind of spoke to you?
I think it was just like I've always been into fantasy and magic. That's always been something that I've really enjoyed. I'm not sure if it's just kind of, I think that's kind of tied to my interest in medieval studies as well, this kind of historical aspect to it. And I think kind of growing up in the UK and being around sort of, historical buildings and castles, and that's just kind of like very much part of my childhood growing up, and we would go on school trips and places, with my family and stuff. And so I think like the magical aspect of it really pulled me in. And I think it's just, I actually remember like my sister read the books first, and I was really upset because she's older than me and she was paying attention to the books and not me. So I remember being so upset when I was sort of like 5 or 6. And I was like, what is the big deal about these books? So I decided to read it and I fell in love with it. And now I love it even more than she does. So that was kind of how that came about. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So kind of back to the academic stuff. I have a political science degree, so I'm more used to like the social science way of writing papers, which requires a lot of research, and even people do quantitative and qualitative analysis. What would you say is the difference between that and writing an English paper?
Yeah, so there's a big difference. So especially with like the social sciences, like you said, it's qualitative, quantitative. There's so many different research methods. You're focusing on experiments, studies conducted. With English, the evidence that you're looking for is within the text itself. So when you're researching, you're not going to look out for other evidence to include in your argument. What you do when you research an English paper is you're looking at other scholarly opinions about the text. And the main reason why you do that in English is to sort of ground your argument with everybody else's opinions. You want to make sure that you have like a full scope of what the topic entails. And that can kind of shape your argument. You can either disagree or agree with kind of what the scholarly opinion is out there. So it's definitely a massive difference to a regular research paper for social sciences. And there's definitely kind of, techniques and skills that you have to develop to know how to research for English papers. And it's also dependent on how popular or how old a book is. So, a Victorian novel is going to have a lot more out there than a novel published in the last few years. So that's another kind of difficulty that you have to face when researching for an English paper as well. Yeah.
So what's an example of a topic for an English research paper?
So I think a good example is if you're looking into Jane Eyre, for example, a classic Victorian novel. And there's so much out there. There's been so much research done. There's entire books compiling scholarly opinions of journals about it. So that's in itself, if you were, a first-year student, you were tasked with a research paper on Jane Eyre, where do you start? That's so overwhelming. So with English especially, I think it's good to have some kind of angle to come into first. That's when your initial kind of understanding and working of the text comes into play, because you need to know what angle you're going in with. So say if you're going to do like a gendered reading of Jane Eyre and you're going to focus on feminist theories, then you would start kind of looking up the keywords when you search up, articles about Jane Eyre. You want to look at the things that include feminist theory, things about how the female characters are treated. You want to make sure that you're focusing on a specific angle rather than just going in and looking at so many different options. So that's something that can definitely help kind of ease the process a bit.
And then, even that is broad. How do you narrow it down even more? Like, a feminist analysis of Jane Eyre is like, a book.
Yeah, so I think a good way to narrow that down is to, especially if you want to only write about one character, I think, because there's so much to write about, it's good to focus on one character. So say, for example, you're going to write about Bertha. You could talk about the gender roles in Victorian society and in trapped women, because obviously there's so much to do with the society and the context around when that was written as well. Those are really important elements to bring into it. So you need to consider what were the roles and the expectations of women. And so what does that mean for why is Bertha being locked up in the attic? Why is Mr. Rochester hiding this wife? Why is he talking to this other woman? Discussing those sort of gender roles and the relationships between the people, that can be an interesting aspect to go into it. So it's good to have sort of a specific thing that you want to talk about in mind, and kind of go from there. But sometimes your research can take you different places. With the characters of Bertha specifically, there's the racial aspect to it too. So it's really important to sort of be aware of all the different kinds of perceptions and theories that you can include in your research.
And it sounds like you're also putting that novel in a historical context. So would you look
Yes.
at both literary sources and history, or like what kinds of sources would a student use?
Yeah, a student would use secondary sources, so typically not first sources, that it wouldn't be anything from the historical period. Perhaps like that could be relevant, but probably more for senior classes. So I think most students would be using secondary sources from sort of, a contemporary modern time, looking back on the context of the novel. But it is important to keep that historical aspect in mind. Yeah.
Okay. So basically you're focusing on the text and
Mhm.
then what other scholars have written about the text, and then you're trying to do what? Agree or disagree with those scholars, find a different approach? Like, how do you make an argument?
Yeah. So especially sort of as you develop in your English degree, the more senior classes, you will be required to have an original take, something that hasn't already been said. But definitely in the earlier years, it is more about having an awareness of what's being said and either finding sources to agree with what you are arguing or disagreeing with the sources out there already. So it definitely varies as you sort of develop across the degree, but definitely in the early years, it's more just being aware, having a scope of what's out there, and being able to read other people's opinions and take on the most important parts and engage with that critically as well, to be able to assert not just your own interpretation, but also engage with other people's interpretations too.
Mhm. And so are there any journals or databases when you go into the public library or university
Mhm.
libraries that are particularly helpful?
Yeah, so I really liked the MLA database. Um, and so that's a common one that a lot of English students use. And it's also got like a really good system of looking up keywords as well. And you can sort of, if you do put the keywords in quotation marks and then that's a good way to combine your keywords when you're searching. So that's a good database that has a lot of information as well.
That's great. That's really helpful practical advice. If there were three things, like three tips you would
Mhm.
give a first year student, or maybe even yourself when you were a first year student, that you think would help you succeed through your degree, what would those be?
Mhm. So I think an important tip would be to continually ask yourself the so what question. And this is just kind of something that is good to sort of remind yourself as you're writing. When you're stating something, ask yourself at the end of that sentence, so what? What's the point of saying this? And that gets you engaging and pushing further to be able to answer your own so what question, so that when you hand in that essay, the professor's not like, what does this mean, what, like, how can you extend this analysis further? You're already asking yourself that. And that doesn't mean that you have to continually explain every single thing that you say, but it's just a good way to get in the mindset of continually pushing your ideas. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's that's a good basic sort of thing in the thinking process. I think another tip, it's so important to have a strong introduction, because that really sets sort of the tone of the rest of the essay. And with that, you want to be able to have a strong opening. And I think a lot of students kind of put redundant statements.
Mm,
I don't know if it's because they sort of panic and don't know how to start the essay, and so they just kind of say a general statement. Which can be a good technique to get words on the page, but always make sure to go and take that out. Because I know from my experience as TA, I would read assignments and they would sort of start with reading is a popular hobby. Um,
it's good for high
okay,
school.
yeah, but that means nothing in the context of, the like, that's irrelevant. So those kind of generalized statements of we read books and books tell stories, that's irrelevant. And especially because first year assignments have so few words, the word count is really restrictive. They're really short assignments. You want to make sure that everything you're saying means something and it goes towards your analysis, that it's really important to be concise. And so
Right.
you don't want to waste your time with sort of random statements like that.
So
You want to get to the point
what's
quickly.
an example of a better hook to the start of an essay?
I think if it depends on the topic, and I quite often like to, when I'm writing essays, to kind of contextualize what I'm going to be talking about rather than just saying this text or this book. But I think something that is interesting is a good opening sentence that includes the topic that you were discussing. And so you can kind of keep it general, but I think it's good to contextualize maybe the time period or the genre that you're discussing, if there's something specific.
Right.
So say that you're talking about Gothic novels. You could do something really interesting with an opening sentence about what Gothic novels do, what their purpose is. Gothic novels really play on our fears of, this, in this novel, this author does this. So it's helpful to have a contextual opening sentence, but make sure that it is relevant to what you're talking about. Don't just kind of have massive generalizations that you're not then going to follow up on.
Right. So it sounds like
Yeah.
it's important to be more specific.
Yeah.
And really make sure every single word is on topic. They're shorter assignments, and so paying attention to being precise, concise, thinking about your language, especially in an English degree. I notice graders and professors, they're paying a lot more attention to grammar and vocabulary choice and stuff like that than say in sociology. Not to first years. I mean, vocabulary and grammar is important in sociology, but I think that's an important piece of the English degree. Is really we want you to be a very good writer.
Yes.
And it's I think social sciences, it's a bit more broad, sweet. Like if you look at the papers, it's broader sweeping. History, philosophy, English, the humanities is really, really about precision with your language.
Yes. And making sure that, the big flowery language, I think it's also clear when a student has used a thesaurus and just kind of, inserted a bigger word just to sound impressive. And that's also not what they want, but they want to make sure that you know and understand the words that you're using, but that you are using sophisticated language. Because I do think a common problem that especially first year students face is using colloquialisms, using everyday terms, using informal language. So as long as it's formal and scholarly academic, you don't have to use these massive words, but make sure that it is formal language that you are using.
Right. So what would your third tip be?
I think the third tip, sort of following on from that introductory part, would be the thesis statement. That's so important. It's the roadmap to an entire essay. And sometimes professors just look at the thesis statement. Sometimes they really single in on that. So you really want to make sure that that is strong. And I'm not sure about every student, but I know for me, when I was in high school, I was told to sort of keep my big point a secret and sort of work up to it in the essay to sort of reveal it at the end. I don't know if students are taught that in high school, but that was something that I sort of had the mindset of like, I need to keep my big point a secret. You don't want to do that at all. You want to reveal that right from the outset. You want to show exactly what you're going to do. And with a thesis statement, it's a very tough skill to master because you have to be concise. You have to explain exactly what your argument is and how you're going to argue that in a sentence or two. So that's a very tough thing to do. And obviously in upper years, that's, it's far more sophisticated. In a first year class, you can just sort of state in this essay, I will argue. A lot of professors are kind of okay with you signaling and signposting exactly what your thesis statement is in those terms. But as long as you make sure that it's clear what you're going to be addressing, and also including, not necessarily in the thesis statement, but the introduction overall is the name of the author in the text. That's something that students seem to forget. And I think they're sort of so caught up, forget to explain what they're going to be talking about. So that's a massive thing to remember to include in the introduction and leading into your thesis statement so that, it's clear to the reader, what are you going to be talking about and whose work are you going to be discussing? So, yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think this is important if you're a student and you're trying to get a decent grade or have the grader understand your point, because I'm sure you can speak to this. You are grading a massive stack of papers within a short period of time.
Yeah.
This goes for high school teachers too. There's not a lot of time to figure out what is this person trying to say. Some graders go like, I look at the intro, look at the conclusion, then I look at the body. So it's really important, as you said in the beginning, to have your introduction clear and that thesis statement clear so the person knows what to expect. And then the other thing is that, you know, if you don't care too much about grades, you just want to be a good writer. This is also important because if you think about when you're doing research, when you're looking through books, when you're looking up journal articles, what do? You go to the intro or the conclusion. This is what I teach my students. Don't read the whole thing. Go to the intro, go to the conclusion or the abstract, and you're literally looking for this person's thesis statement to figure out, is this an article I want to read? So you might think, oh, this is dumb, you know, they're too hard on me for this. But this is important for becoming a clear writer. And in fact, if you're reading, and I'm sure if you've read some articles and you're like, what is this article about? Main idea. You know, that's frustrating. So think about, you don't want someone to have that experience when reading your work. Right? You want it to be clear.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to make sure that whoever is grading your paper knows upfront that you are going to address the question. You don't want to have to get to sort of paragraph 3 or 4 for them to be like, okay, now we're getting to it. So you want to do that from the outset.
So just summarize, what are your 3 tips?
Yeah, so the 3 tips are the so what question, making sure that you are concise, getting rid of anything that's redundant, and having a strong thesis statement. So a lot of that is focused on the introduction, but I think that's a really good start to setting the tone for the rest of your paper.
Okay, cool. That's really good advice. We've been talking a lot about first-year university students, undergraduate students. In Canada, in most provinces, English, you have to do well in English and not English language, English literature, to go on to do post-secondary studies. It is weighted the same or sometimes higher than math and definitely many of the sciences. So even if you're going to go off and do engineering, you do have to be able to, you know, master English. What advice would you have for high school students or high school students in English going off to university? So like, as I said, even if you're in engineering, you're gonna have to take engineering English. Even if you're in science, most universities actually require you to take English 101. So there's a big difference between high school and university. What can these high school students do?
Yeah, so I think first off, the difference between high school and university, like, you're going to be reading so much more, and that can be a massive shock to the system, because you'll have multiple readings a week. You'll, especially for an English class, you could be reading a whole novel a week, and just spend 1 or 2 lectures on it and then move on. And that's 300 or 400 pages that you just spent reading for one class, and then you have to move on. So it is very fast paced. And I think that could be something that you could gradually get used to, is, you know, increasing your reading. I even recommend a lot having like scheduling. Especially if you kind of have like numerical mind, if you like to think in numbers, breaking down the page numbers of, okay, you're going to read 25 pages today. Having a goal like that can really help people to sort of get to that point, rather than just seeing it as like a massive tome of a book. And it's, you know, 400 pages. If you break it down, that's a really good way of approaching it. So that's something that high school students could, you know, progressively get to that point of reading more, breaking it down so that it's manageable. And hopefully by the time they get to university, that won't be as shocking and you know, sort of overwhelming. So that's kind of a good way to get into it. Another thing I think would be to sort of practice even if it's not required at a high school level, just kind of practice when you're reading a book, going through and picking out things that you think are going to be important. So comments on the setting, for example, or the character. Is there a massive plot point that's going to be important? Just kind of picking those out, and that's why those kind of the colored tabs are really helpful, or post-it notes, sticky notes. Kind of, especially if you're a visual learner, that could be a really helpful thing to do. If you color code it and you say, okay, setting is going to be green, and so you know all the pages that you've tabbed, that's a significant part of setting. And what I mean by that is that say that they introduce a new location in the novel and there's a description of the setting. I always kind of go back to a Gothic setting because it's just, there's so much to it. But if they're kind of explaining the darkness and, the mystery shrouding the place, that's really good, important information for the setting. So that, for example, if you come back to analyzing it, you can go back to those green tabbed pages, pull out those quotes, and that's half your work already done. So again, even if that's not something required at high school level, it's good to just get into that kind of mindset of picking up the important things as you go. And so that's something that, especially if you do have to analyze the book at the end, you'll thank yourself so much when you get to the end and you've identified a lot of key parts, even if you don't use everything, which you probably won't. But it's going to help you out in the long run so much. So that's definitely something that you could practice. Yeah,
and you know what? You could use that in any class. Psychology, math. Like if you just start identifying patterns in the textbook, like, okay, where's their definition? When are they talking about cognitive psychology or something? So then it'll help you a lot just going back with the studying.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think you're talking about reading fiction, but we could apply these same strategies to reading nonfiction or learning nonfiction, is figuring out, asking yourself those same questions. What is important? What's going to be important? I guess obviously maybe you're not asking questions about setting, but but picking out those key points, are there certain things repeating? So when you're talking about setting, you're really talking about something repeating or changing in the novel, right?
Yes.
And you could do the same thing in a text on, like I said, psychology. If certain things come up, and like oftentimes there's an evolution of work, right? And how they interpret something, and you could tab that. So that's a really good overall tip.
Yeah, and it's a really good way to just kind of train your brain into thinking of those things and being able to quickly identify them, because I know it can be quite alien for people to sort of, put those tabs in initially and have to be like, oh yeah, I need to do that. But once you get going and you actually get used to it, it is a good way to just sort of train your brain into doing that. So yeah, it can definitely be applied to so many things as well.
Right. And you know what? I'm going kind of off the tangent of going off on a tangent. I think this really speaks to the idea and the misconception, and I think a lot of us have it in high school. If at least I lived in a small town, like there's not people going to university. Like university or college is kind of like, and
it's a big deal.
Scary, and like, oh my gosh, how are these people so smart? And just there's a few people that have photographic memories, and I've met those people in university. But most people have good study skills. And so what you're talking about here is developing good study skills. And that's really what will help you succeed. And not only in university, but when you go to work. I mean, because depending on what you do, you're still going to have to read. You're still going to have to organize information. You're still going to have to communicate that information. Even if you're not working so much with words, if you're working with numbers or you're visual, an artist, you do have to have a way to organize your work process. So I think a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm not smart enough or something. No, it's really just about learning how to organize and manage information, and then communicate it to an audience, the different audience in different ways, in a way they can understand.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of like to flip it. If you already do those things, you can definitely apply them to something like English if that's sort of unfamiliar to you. So sometimes I know that people can sort of think like, oh, I'm not used to reading a lot and I don't know big words. That seems really intimidating. I'm only taking English as an elective. But if you already have those skills somewhere else, they're applicable other places too. So it definitely works across a variety of different places. So yeah, it's really important to sort of identify those, and then you can apply them. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else to say about high school students, or that?
I would say just one more thing is that I think it would be good to, if you were reading a book for high school or personally in your own time, write up a book review of it. It's not going to be a book review at university level. It's going to be far more than that. But write up a book review. You could, post it on Goodreads, or you could keep it private. Whatever you want to do, but I think that's a good way to sort of get you thinking back on what you just read and thinking, did I like this book? What didn't I like about it? Did I understand it? What is my mind going back to? What part am I enjoying? To sort of get you engaging with those things. And so I think that would sort of be a good setup to when you do have to fully analyze a text. That's kind of getting you already in the process of thinking back on a text and looking back and being able to identify those things. So writing book review, I think that could really help.
That's interesting. When I taught last year, I was teaching Ontario high school English in China online. And I gave them all an extra assignment of doing a book report in front of the class, because for them, speaking is actually often harder than writing. They don't get a lot of practice speaking English. And I asked them, did you like this book? Why or why not? And they had to think about that. And, I also wanted them to identify literary devices or whatever. But that's a good point. We often read things and we don't think about, did we like it and why or why not? And just practicing that and sharing it. The practice of writing it out, sharing it with your friend or online or on Instagram or whatever, it's just a good practice for, putting your ideas out there in general and having them evaluated or by others.
Yeah, and even engaging with, if you go and look up other people's reviews, I quite often do that when I finish a book, because I like to sort of know what everybody else is thinking. That's a good way to sort of, in an informal amateur way, kind of be doing your own research, looking up what other people are doing and saying about that text. So that's a good way to get into the practice of what you're then going to be doing for an English research paper, of looking up scholarly opinions, if you're just looking up informal reviews online. So there's an added element there that's really going to be helpful as well. Yeah.
Tons of good advice in this podcast. A lot of people think, why would you do an arts degree? You're not going to get a job. And especially, why are you doing an English degree in Canada? Like, you're going to be like an ESL teacher? So what do you think is the value of an English degree?
I think that's a very common critique of it, but it has so much value. I don't think people sort of understand and appreciate the skills that you develop. Writing, reading, close reading, being able to have observational skills, being able to sort of read between the lines. That's really helpful in social situations. You can apply those skills that you have to close reading and being able to identify something that the author isn't outright saying. Those things you can put into use in social situations. So there's so many ways that can be applicable in real life. And I think just, the basic sort of reading and writing skills that you need in everyday life, in all kinds of walks of life and jobs, that's going to be useful too. But I think it also teaches empathy. I think there's a really sort of human emotional element to it too, because you spend so much time in the mind of a character, or people from different cultural backgrounds, from all different characters, and there's so much within a novel that I think you can learn about our real life and humans. And I think sometimes it's easier to sympathize with a fictional character than it is a real person. And so when you sort of have those skills developed from fiction, then you can apply that to real life. And so I think there's so many kind of skills that go unnoticed. It's not just about getting a well-paid job. I think it's also things that make you a well-rounded being. Like, so I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, such a good point. There's so many thoughts in my head right now. But this reminds me of the ancient Greeks, because the ancient Greeks, I'm not like a specialist on Greece or something, but I know that they would have festivals that were around plays and literature and all of this stuff, and part of the reason is that was part of your civic education. That going to these plays was about understanding like the values and morals of the society, of seeing yourself in these different characters, of being able to talk about or get people to talk about or think about things that would be hard to just have a direct discussion about. So I think we kind of forget that because we live in a very more and more quantitative, technical world, like robots are doing things for us now, we forget that people are inherently storytellers.
Yeah.
Like if you talk to someone, when you meet someone, I guarantee you the people you think are the most engaging are not the people with all the facts and not the people with the fancy handbag maybe, but if they can tell you a really funny story about how they got this handbag and they dropped it in a puddle and this little dog ran off with it, and you're going to get engaged with the handbag or the person. So I think, being able to tell stories, being able to take from stories these lessons. And then I think another thing, I'm a really huge fan of this channel called School of Life. And one thing on there, there's one video and it's kind of about loneliness or smart people being lonely or something. But one piece is that you can always find connections in books. So sometimes when we're alone, like say during COVID, and we can't go out and see people, I don't think it's not surprising to me that like Netflix viewing went up. People were ordering all these books because, as you said, you can connect with a fictional character and in a way that's different than maybe even the person sitting next to you on the couch watching the show on Netflix. There's something about literature and using our imagination that just taps into a part of ourselves we can't get necessarily walking down the street, going to the grocery store or whatever. So I think you bring up a really good point there that, and it's important to be a well-rounded human being.
Yeah. And I know, like, for me, I enjoyed English classes a lot because it felt like a big book club where we could all talk about our opinions and our interpretations. And maybe for someone in psychology, that could be really fascinating to actually observe everyone's different interpretations and how that reflects on humans. So maybe there is even like a social sciences aspect to it. But I think that's just a really important part of like being able to listen to someone else. And because there's no one right answer, I think some people can really struggle with that, but I think that's also the beauty of it too, is that there are so many different interpretations and everyone can have different opinions on it, and as long as that's sort of respectfully appreciated and understood, you can have some really good conversations from that.
And that's also another point of maybe how it's transferable, is that in the world, our world's very complex, and we have these problems, say, with like climate change and global warming, and you have to have a kind of creative mind, collaborative sense of humanity to solve these big problems. And so something as simple as talking about different interpretations in an English class, we could translate that to like, what are the different ways we can solve this massive global issue? So those critical thinking skills are really valuable, no matter what you go off and do. So, okay, it sounds like a lot of good takeaways from your English class, your English degrees. Is there any sort of takeaway in terms of writing?
Yeah, I think my sort of main takeaway with writing especially was that there's so many ways to phrase things and, you know, put things in a sentence, and everybody's going to have a different way of doing it. So I think like that's so, you know, amazing that everyone can have a different voice and style, and everyone can be tasked with the same thing but not say it in the same way. And so I think a big takeaway for me is that it's okay to not write something the same way that someone else does. There's definitely ways of improving your writing style. Obviously, there's so many ways of making sure that you can be like concise and you can use appropriate language and all of those things that we've been discussing. That's, you know, helpful tips. But at the end of the day, I think it's amazing that everyone can have their own kind of style. And I think like that was something, especially in the beginning, if you're, you know, entering university and you're overwhelmed and you're thinking, is everybody so much smarter than me? And what's that person saying? How are they saying it? And you end up comparing yourself to someone else. But I think at the end of the day, you're never going to write something the same way as someone else. And I think that should be seen as like a really good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like art. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
I like editing papers. To me, it's like a puzzle. It's like I have all these words and punctuation and a certain, especially if I have to cut something down, the word count. Because now I have this constraint and I have to figure out, how do I say what this person's trying to say within this small space, and I have to keep rejigging the puzzle and until I can fit it into this little. So it's like, it's not a Rubik's Cube. It's, I don't know, what's something where you'd have to put it in a specific thing. It's reminding me of those childhood toys where you like put the square and the square and the circle and the circle and the triangle and the triangle.
Oh yeah. You
can't put the triangle in the square, you know, and it's like that kind of process. So yeah, that's a really good point. Just learning, I guess, learning to trust your own voice is what you're saying.
Yeah.
And really what you're doing is just learning the principles of writing. And then once you know those, then you can apply them in whatever way, you know, resonates with you. Yeah,
absolutely.
Obviously you like books. You both like books. And one thing I like to do at the end is have our guest give a few book recommendations. What would be 1 or 2 or 3 books, whatever, I'm not sure how many you have there, that you would recommend to an incoming student or someone taking an English class?
Well, first off, I would start with the editions. There's so many different editions, especially if you're working with classics, because quite often first year university classes, they'll have sort of those big name classic novels. And so you want to make sure that you have an edition that's going to help you. So an edition that I like is the Broadview Press editions. And so those are the ones that have a specific editor who writes the introduction to the novel. They annotate, they have footnotes, and they have appendices at the end with sources from other scholars. And so that's a really helpful place to start with your research too, if you have that edition. And it can be really helpful for those sort of big, dense classic novels. If you're unfamiliar with them, if you haven't really read them before and you just come into it and it's so intimidating, if you just have someone who's already pointing out the old-fashioned language and the sort of modern phrasing that we would use in the footnotes, that's really helpful. So it's definitely good to have an edition that's going to do that for you. And I would recommend the Jane Eyre one. It was edited by a professor of mine, Richard Emersvary. So I really enjoyed. We actually read Jane Eyre in a Victorian class that he taught. So that was really amazing that we sort of had that conversation with the editor of a novel. So that was really great. So I think those kind of classics are really good to have as well. So the Jane Eyre, Great Expectations. Really sort of, I know this could be really intimidating, but those are big novels that are assigned in first year university classes. So it's really helpful to sort of, get those under your belt. And I think too, I know for me, I like short stories. I think those can be a really helpful way to sort of transition into literary analysis, things that you're going to be analyzing at university level. So I recommend Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark. Nathaniel Hawthorne is the author of The Scarlet Letter, if that's sort of, quite famous. And I think that's a really good short story that's jam-packed full of metaphors, literary devices. There's so much content in there to analyze. So I think that's a good start to sort of be able to pick out those things. And I'd also recommend the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. It's just perfect for this time of the year as well. I love Edgar Allan Poe and his stories, and I think there's so much to sort of work through in that too. So those are some really sort of great things to sort of sink your teeth into and get into that analysis. So those are kind of the things that I would suggest someone sort of coming in that they want to get a head start.
Okay, that's a big list. So
yeah,
broad view editions, Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, but that's Dickens, right?
Yes.
Short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. I missed the Scarlet Letter guy. What's that?
Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Birthmark.
Okay, The Birthmark.
I think that was it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's great. I think I have most of. I don't have that short story, but Poe has some great stuff. And if you just read about him, like, you can understand
you get why it's so dark.
Okay, well, great. I think there's a lot of good stuff in this short interview, so I hope that English students, high school students will listen to this, and thanks so much, or have listened to it if it's the end. Thanks so much for coming in and being our guest today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really enjoyable to sort of break this down and discuss it. So, yeah.
You're welcome. This should be called like writer nerds chat or something.
Yeah.
So you can find out more about Natalia on our website, www.fau.ca, and stay tuned for a short meditation and writing exercise that this week is going to be led by Natalia.